I've got a challenge for you.
All right.
We're a queer history podcast,
Yeah.
You've pointed that out a couple times.
Maybe.
And, our episodes tend to be between 30 and, 45, 50 minutes.
Yeah. I have thoughts.
Yeah. So it's kind of impossible to talk about queer history and not talk about the 1980s and the AIDS crisis. So why don't you go ahead and sum up the AIDS crisis in about 45 minutes?
Wait, are you saying that there's going to be a two-parter?
No, I'm saying this is going to be a four-part miniseries.
Four-parter?
Yeah.
What?
Incoming broadcast. You're listening to .fem.
Welcome to .fem. My name's Danielle Gonzalez.
I'm Claire.
It's pretty difficult to talk about queer history and not talk about the AIDS crisis. But when we were discussing how we wanted to cover the AIDS crisis of the 80s and 90s, we realized that it really wasn't possible to condense the whole thing down into a single 45-minute episode of the podcast. So we decided for HIV Awareness Month, which is this month, December.
That's right.
That we would do a 4-part special mini-series all about the AIDS crisis. And in each episode, we're going to talk about a different aspect of it. And today, we're talking about the history and the politics that led to the whole making of a massacre, if you will.
Wow.
What do you know about the AIDS crisis, Claire? I mean, you and I, we've grown up, in the post-1996 world, which...
Well, I mean, I know that the way my cis heterosexual dad talked about it, which, was like, he was astonished, but he was the way he described it felt very respectful. I understand that Reagan was a big part of this, but I don't know to what capacity. I know about my friends and family, my chosen family, who have experienced AIDS in different ways. I've heard their own stories, and I've met a couple people with AIDS over the last few years, which, each and every one of them has their own stories of this whole thing. So, like, I have a bunch of little pieces that I have heard throughout the years, but I've never really heard the whole thing put together. So I don't know, I'm really excited to hear all about it.
Yeah, well, then this should be pretty informative over the next 4 weeks. But today we're going to dive into just the history and the politics, the political environment that really contributed to the situation. So I'd like to start by actually tracing the disease, talking about where it came from and how it got here. Now, I should probably disclaim that this isn't necessarily the definitive answer. This is one proposed and likely scenario for where the disease came from. But this is relatively widely accepted. And as we discuss, you'll see how a lot of these pieces seem to fit this theory pretty well. As we know, AIDS is a condition that is created by the HIV virus, the human immunodeficiency virus, which is a offshoot, a mutation of a virus that affects chimpanzees and other simian species, which is called SIV, or the simian immunodeficiency virus. And we do know about roughly when the virus made the jump from apes to humans. There are epidemiologists and virologists who know, way more about the science than I do, but they're able to trace the genome of the disease back to within plus or minus a decade of when it jumped. And so we know that the HIV virus originated in Central Africa, in the Congo region, around 1930, give or take 10 years. It's thought that the disease most likely came from a hunter who was hunting chimpanzees for meat, for food, And while preparing that meat, it made the jump from species to species through blood to blood transmission. But what's interesting is what happened in 1930, because we talk about it made the jump in 1930,
Right.
but like it's not like it hadn't ever infected humans before.
Oh, really?
People in the region were probably contracting SIV for decades, if not potentially centuries, prior to this. The thing was that the virus probably died out relatively quickly. It wasn't particularly serious just because it hadn't yet mutated to really thrive in the human body. It was still the simian immunodeficiency virus. But 1930 is when it made that mutation, jumped, and really began to thrive. And in fact, we've been able to trace the very first confirmed death from AIDS
Wow.
to 1959 in the Congo. So, and that's kind of an interesting time period for that region of the world, because around that time in the mid 1960s, both the Belgian Congo and the French Congo colonies, which were previously colonies of Belgium and France respectively, they achieved their independence in the mid 1960s. And so when that happened, a lot of the French and Belgian Europeans who were living there, they left. They went back to France and Belgium, and the independent Congolese governments would contract with the Haitian government to bring in French-speaking professionals to come in and fill the professions that these Europeans had now vacated. But by the 1980s, most of the Haitians that had come in had left the Congo and either returned to Haiti or immigrated away either to Europe or to the United States. So that's kind of the environment that we're in. Now, when we're talking about the actual AIDS crisis, that starts early 80s, late 80 to 81. The first cases appeared in San Francisco and New York, kind of simultaneously. But what was notable was that these cases were active in the gay community in both cities, San Francisco and New York. And it was, that was particularly interesting because it led doctors to wonder, what is it about gay men or a homosexual lifestyle that is causing this disease, if in fact there's a link there? Now, important for us to know, looking back now, with 40 years behind us, that obviously there were probably infections, and even deaths probably leading up to the 80s all across the country,
Right.
but they were, misdiagnosed, they were underreported.
Right.
But it was these initial cluster of cases in 1980, 1981 that really started to get the attention of the medical community. And the CDC is, in particular, reported about this new disease in the MMWR weekly newsletter that they had go out. It was called the Mortality and Morbidity Weekly Report in mid 1981, right around, I think, June or July. And at this time, this disease, it was brand new. It didn't have a name. So they, the CDC initially called it gay-related immune deficiency, or GRID.
So from the very get-go, they've already associated this disease with gay people. That's crazy.
Well, how else would you...
It set itself up.
How else would you associate it? Let me ask you this.
Yeah, but
if you had a case of 10 people showing the same symptoms and all 10 of them were gay and they were the only ones you had noticed so far that had this disease, how else would you classify it?
Sure. I just what I'm saying is that from the very beginning, the thought process was, this is a disease that only affects gay people. It's the term is GRID, GRID, gay related immune deficiency. So the general consensus at this point in time, and the way that this precedent is set, is saying that this is a disease that only affects gay people. So of course, from the very beginning, there's already precedent that says, like, we don't have to worry about anybody else because this is a gay-related immune deficiency disease. It's just, I feel like this is just a shortcoming of this naming. And, like, to be fair, you know, they didn't have any perspective over what this was about to become. But also, like, you know, gay people at this time were oppressed. And so by naming it a gay-related immune deficiency disease, like, you're already setting this up for, like, dismissal.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, one of the things that I think is really important to keep in mind is that there was no way for them to realize that this wasn't only affecting the gay community at the time that this was named. So, like, I get where the name comes from.
Sure.
And in fact, that is very important as we take this journey over these next 4 episodes to talk about, you know, the actual impact of this disease. But initially, you know, you have to name the disease something. And the only thing they know about it at this point is that it's an immune deficiency. It's affecting the immune system, and it's only showing up in gay men so far, or at least that's how it appears to be.
Sure.
One of the reasons that this disease is so kind of tricky, and we'll talk a lot more about this in the next episode next week, but this particular disease doesn't really have a whole lot of symptoms of its own. All of the disease, all of the symptoms that you get are from opportunistic infections. In the case of the cluster in New York, what people were contracting or showing symptoms of was a type of rare skin cancer called Kaposi sarcoma. And that skin cancer really only affects people whose immune system has already been compromised, right? And then in San Francisco, in the San Francisco and Los Angeles clusters, they were experiencing pneumocystic pneumonia, which again it's an opportunistic infection. It's a type of pneumonia that really only affects people whose immune systems are already compromised. So all they know at this point is that the immune system is weakened from something, and it seems to only be in a cluster of gay men in both of these cities. So, you know, logically, what else would you call that? Especially with the mindset of we want to get this out as efficiently as possible to other healthcare providers so that they immediately know what potential risk groups to talk to and start screening. So what else would they call it but gay-related immune deficiency? I completely agree. Calling it that right off the bat is going to assign a social stigma to it, but it also is kind of effective at just straight up communicating to the other medical providers what the disease is and who it's affecting initially. So
definitely,
it is kind of a shitty situation to be in, but unfortunately that's how that happened. But right at the same time, they were also noticing something interesting happening in South Florida. Some local healthcare providers notice, after reading about GRID in the MMWR, they notice, well, that's interesting because that sounds a lot like what's been happening recently in the Haitian community. So they, you know, contact the CDC and they're like, we might have some cases of what you're calling GRID in the Haitian community, but not in homosexuals, just in strictly in heterosexuals. And the CDC didn't really know what to make of that connection. So they weren't given as much weight as they should have been. It was thought that they're probably not the same thing. And
interesting,
you know, it's already kind of creating this sort of web of confusion that's happening. Add to that a complication where healthcare providers in France and Belgium are noticing similar cases in mid-81 that, you know, also seem to match the description in the MMWR. But again, in heterosexual individuals, this, you know, it creates this web of confusion that's like, we don't understand what's happening. And this is moving so fast.
Right.
It was moving like wildfire. Before the CDC even kind of had any idea, what they were dealing with, suddenly cases of the disease start showing up in the intravenous drug use community, heroin users and other, injectable drugs.
Oh, yeah.
In Brooklyn. And at this point, it's like the transmissibility of the disease is skyrocketing because it was very common, especially pre-80s, that folks would share needles.
Yeah.
It's this needle sharing in the IV drug community caused the number of cases to just blow up like crazy. But what really set the world on fire was in late 1981, there was a case in a newborn infant who was like 3 months old.
What?
And at that point, it was like, okay, well, clearly this 3-month-old hasn't been having gay sex and they haven't been injecting drugs. How could this baby get GRID? How could this infant have the disease? And so they went back in the infant's medical records, and this infant had been born prematurely and had required some blood transfusions. So this pointed the doctors to, oh, fuck, our blood supply might be tainted. That's a problem. And so doctors were immediately ringing alarm bells, and they were like, we gotta start.
Yeah, we gotta figure this out.
Yeah, we gotta figure this out. And even though the doctors raised the alarms immediately, a lot of folks kind of discredited them as being alarmist, that they were, blowing things out of proportion, that it couldn't be in the blood supply like this. But honestly, even if they had been taken seriously, it was kind of already too late. I mean, it was already in the blood supply. The blood supply was tainted. Blood products that were made from donated blood were already tainted and affected. But one of the reasons that this was so troubling was they didn't have a good test for the disease for the blood supply. So even if they were able to stop taking blood immediately, how could you test? How could you figure out who has the disease and who doesn't when they're donating?
Yeah, it was still so early, like at this point
is still
in time.
In under a year, this is happening. So in 1982, the CDC officially gave the disease like an official title. It was called Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, or AIDS. Now, we still, in 1982, we didn't know what was causing AIDS.
Right.
We just knew
what it did,
what the symptoms were, and
right.
now...
And it's exploding.
Now it's affecting 4 different groups. And this kind of gave rise to a new unofficial name for the disease. It was now being called the 4-H disease. And it was called 4-H disease because of the 4 H's that it affected: homosexuals, hemophiliacs, heroin users, and Haitians. All, you could say, in the 80s that were not particularly desirable groups politically, right?
Sure.
They weren't super important voting blocks.
They were looked over.
Right. So this starts to sort of snowball into a political environment that was perfect for the disease to run rampant. In 1982, there's a particular moment where a reporter named Lester Kinsolving, who is in the White House press pool, he's in a press conference with the White House press secretary of the time, Larry Speaks, and Lester Kinsolving asks the press secretary if President Reagan had any thoughts on the CDC announcing that this new disease, AIDS, is now officially an epidemic. And Speaks was very dismissive.
He was homophobic.
He was very glib about it.
Oh, God.
He was cracking homophobic jokes. There's a recording of it that I've listened to. It's pretty upsetting.
Wait, can we play that?
You want to listen to it?
I kind of do.
All right.
I kind of want to hear the way that the country was thinking about AIDS and queer people at that time.
I checked earlier with Dr. Ruby this morning, and he said no. Something from the AIDS or whatever it is.
They're so dismissive. Like they weren't even acknowledging it at that time.
No, it seemed like the official position of the White House was to ignore it,
Wow.
crack jokes, to laugh about it. Not great. In 1983, Margaret Heckler, who was Reagan's Secretary of Health and Human Services, she was looking to the scientists to set her priorities on AIDS. But President Reagan, when he ran for president, he ran on this whole affordability thing. And stop me if this sounds a little familiar.
All right.
Reagan talked about taxes being too high, too much government spending, groceries were too expensive, and he was going to bring all that stuff down.
Yeah, that sounds familiar. You can stop right there. Sorry.
President Reagan was really focused on trying to cut the budget. And these budget cuts really hurt the CDC at this time.
Of course.
In fact, the CDC's budget was cut by like 25%. And because of that 25% budget cut, travel for research was restricted. It's honestly kind of crazy. For the first 2 years of this crisis, the CDC had no resources. In fact, CDC scientists were talking about how they had to borrow from other agencies, other government agencies, just to research this disease. So, money, or the lack of money, was a huge limiting factor when it came to doing something to try and limit the spread of HIV.
So wait. I have a question here.
Yeah.
So 1983, did Dr. Fauci say anything about this time where like there wasn't any money or anything? I know that in the interview, he spoke a little bit about how this early 80s was just the darkest time that he was experiencing personally, because, everybody was just dying. Like there was no cure. There was nothing that they could do.
Yeah. Well, I asked Dr. Fauci how, and I believe what I asked was very specifically, how did the Reagan administration's reluctance to publicly acknowledge the disease affect his work as a researcher?
Yeah.
And, well, we can listen to what he said.
The amount of effort, I spent a considerable amount of effort in the 80s of trying to get more money into the AIDS effort. Reagan was a complicated guy when it came to HIV. He had a lot of gay friends in Hollywood, but he was surrounded, and he himself ideologically was very, very conservative. So the idea about gay men and gay sex and injection drug use and commercial sex work was something you didn't even want to mention publicly, even though he knew it was very important. So it didn't stop us from realizing how important it was. But I don't think that we put enough resources in early on, because we didn't have presidential leadership in saying we need to put a lot more money into this. I think it did, affect our effort in that we could have put more resources in. But interestingly, when George H.W. Bush came in, he started to see the importance of putting more resources in. And that's when, together with the Congress, who was very, very helpful, that's when we went from a small to modest amount of resources to a substantial amount of resources.
So, yeah, money was a huge limiting factor. And in fact, as the crisis starts to really begin to explode over these first couple years, Congress calls in Margaret Heckler to ask if the HHS needs any additional resources to combat AIDS. And Margaret Heckler tells Congress no additional funding is needed to deal with the AIDS crisis.
Oh my God.
And this is at a time when the CDC is meeting with executives in the blood transfusion industry to discuss what to do about the possibility of a tainted blood supply, a blood supply that has been tainted for 2 years, mind you.
Right.
In this meeting that the CDC had with them, CDC scientists are talking about how they need to roll out some way to test the blood for whether or not it's been contaminated. And what they know about the disease at this point in time is that a test for hepatitis B has shown to be fairly effective at screening whether or not the blood contains HIV. It's not as effective as people would like, but 80% effective. So it's not nothing. So the CDC is like, we should at least be testing the blood supply with this. These CDC doctors, and especially Dr. Don Francis, they're getting very frustrated and exasperated with these CEOs who also held medical degrees, but they were at this point focused more on running their business than they were actually caring for patients, or at least that's my assessment. I can't speak for where their head was at, but these executives are dragging their feet, stomping, and they're like,
is the CDC seriously suggesting that the blood industry spend $100 million a year to use a test for the wrong disease because we've had a handful of transfusion fatalities and 8 dead hemophiliacs?
And that particular question really riled up Dr. Francis, who famously shouted at them,
how many dead hemophiliacs do you need?
Oh my God.
How many people have to die to make it cost efficient for you people to do something about it? 100? 1,000? Give us a number so we won't annoy you again until the amount of money you begin spending on lawsuits makes it more profitable for you to save people than to kill them.
Oh my
so
God.
you could see this, like the social and political environment that's here. It's just not being taken seriously. But the disease is continuing to.
And these are, to be clear, these are the executives of
in the blood supply industry.
In the blood supply industry.
So like the companies that are.
I didn't realize that the blood supply industry was privatized.
Well, I mean, yeah, private companies are the ones that make the storage equipment, the draw equipment, all that kind of stuff.
Wow.
And this is all at a time where the disease is continuing to explode. There's an activist, gay and AIDS activist, Larry Kramer. We'll talk about him in episode 4 of this series. But he publishes an essay about the impact of AIDS on the gay community at this time in 1983 called 1121 and Counting. And this is just a frantic plea for the community to get angry and mobilize and do something and start, making waves at, what they were seeing is just this deafening silence coming from the government and a slow response coming from the scientific community. And the queer community really started to, rise up, and they were like, hey, it's not gay related. This can affect anyone. It doesn't come from gay people, and this shit is really not helping our community. And we'll talk more about this in episode 3 of this miniseries, but acceptance of the queer community in the 70s was actually on a rise. And we talked a little bit about it when we did that episode with Matt Baum. Queer characters on television and, gaining steady acceptance. There was steady progress being made, but this particular crisis brought all of that crashing down. The public largely had this view that this was just a gay men's disease, but approximately half these cases were in straight women. So
I didn't know that.
The public doesn't even know how widespread this disease is and that it's broken outside of the gay community.
So it was gay men first and then cis heterosexual women who got it?
Well, it was gay men and trans women primarily. And then, heterosexual women, and they transmit it to heterosexual men. And, there are a lot of different ways this disease can proliferate. But the first known cases that were identified as being this particular disease were in clusters of gay men and then in heterosexual women in the Haitian community. And, it spread out from there. Around this time, officials in various cities, and especially in cities with a prominent gay community, like San Francisco, are working with the public health department to try and limit the spread of this disease. And one of the ways that they did this was to start closing gay bathhouses.
Not the bathhouses.
Well, scientific researchers knew that one way that this disease was proliferating was through sexual intercourse, both gay sex and straight sex. Either way, they knew that it was coming from sexual intercourse. And these gay bathhouses, especially in San Francisco, were known to be sexual hotbeds. You know, gay men would go, they would hang out, they would hook up, you know, so it was a place that the disease was really kind of, you know, exploding there. So the health department was like, you know, we got to close these places down. We got to try and limit the spread of this disease. But the gay community, who, remember, at this point in time, fresh off the 70s, was just beginning to experience an upswing of acceptance. They started to see this as, what if they're lying and it's not actually about the disease? What if they're just using that as an excuse to close down our community spaces?
Whoa. So
there were a lot of queer folks that were very opposed to the closing of these bathhouses, even temporarily. But it's you see how complicated and messy this situation is becoming.
Well, yeah, it's just becoming so, it's exactly. It's like becoming so much more intertwined, and like the further, and like what we're coming up on 4 years now, right, through this whole thing. And like, we're starting to see this branch out of the gay community now. We're starting to see this affect like the greater community spaces.
Right.
It's, you know, it's, as you said earlier, a firestorm.
Yeah.
And it's still being dismissed.
Right. Well, and one of the reasons it was being dismissed or so easy to sort of disregard is because, remember, like you said, we're coming up on like 4 years of the crisis now, and scientists still don't know what's causing it. They know what the symptoms are.
Right.
They know what the disease looks like, but they still don't have an agent that's driving this disease.
Right. They
know it's probably a virus, but they can't identify the virus. They can't find it. They can't figure out where it is, what is causing this. Until May of 1984, they finally figure it out. And Margaret Heckler holds a press conference to announce the discovery of the virus that causes AIDS and the development of a blood test. So finally, we know what it is. And we'll get more into this next week. But in May of 1984, we found it. That we know the virus that causes AIDS. So Margaret Heckler holds this press conference to announce the discovery of the virus causing AIDS. She also kind of, you know, jumped the gun and announced that a vaccine is expected within the next 2 years.
Really?
Well, here's the thing. Normally, at least up until this point in time, once you identify a virus, you can develop a vaccine for that virus in about 18 months. That's always been kind of the time frame in the past. So there was no reason to expect anything different. HHS Secretary Heckler, you know, we've identified the virus. Like previous viruses in the past, we'll probably have a vaccine within 2 years.
Oh my God.
But as we all know now,
that is such a betrayal, though. Like, yeah, I mean, obviously, you know, hindsight's 2020 here, but imagine living through that time, hearing seeing every single friend that you have, like, you know, either dead or, you know, getting this disease, you know, frightened as hell about it. Then the CDC says, hey, by the way, we're going to have a vaccine in 2 years. You're anticipating that for 2 years, and then 2 years comes and goes and there's no change.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair though, this particular virus works so differently than anything we had seen in the past. And that's part of what made this crisis so devastating.
Yeah, but put yourself in the shoes of like a gay man there in that time frame. That is such a betrayal. And like, I really just empathize so much more deeply after hearing just the first half of this episode. I didn't quite grasp like just how dismissive everybody was, and how, like, you know, regardless of like, you know, the medical advancements and like the complexity of the disease and stuff like that, like from a layman's perspective.
Maybe, but I mean, I have empathy for the scientists that genuinely want to help.
Definitely.
They're trying to find and grasp at any form of hope that they can find. And if you think that you'll be able to find a vaccine within 2 years because it's never been a problem in the past, why wouldn't you tell people that? Why wouldn't you try and give them that hope? Right? It's a very complicated situation.
Definitely.
I mean, I can see, especially looking back from this point now, knowing that in 2 years they wouldn't have a vaccine. But if you didn't know that and you have just been diagnosed with AIDS and told you have, you know, on the outside 18 months to live, and then, you know, someone from the government says we should have a vaccine within the next 2 years, there's a chance you might get it. There's a chance you might live long enough to get that vaccine and survive, right? And like, yeah, that does make it devastating when it doesn't come, but it's not like they knew it wouldn't come and they were just saying this. They had every reason to believe that they would be able to find one. And if you honestly believe you'd be able to find a vaccine in 2 years and give that level of hope to people who need it, why wouldn't you? So I have empathy for you know, the people who are afflicted with this disease at the time, but I also have empathy for the scientists who genuinely want to help and are trying to find hope at any turn, especially because now at this point, literally nothing they've been able to do has been helping. And they've had to watch these patients that they've built up these relationships with, that they become very close with, that they become good friends with. They've had to watch them die.
So did they find a vaccine in 2 years?
No, they didn't find a vaccine in 2 years. And in fact, by early 1985, the following year, the number of deaths was doubling. HIV had infected at least 500,000 Americans and over 2 million globally. And yet the Reagan administration still has not publicly acknowledged the disease. President Reagan has not publicly said the word AIDS. This show is powered by our community. No ads, no algorithms, just people who care. So if you want to help .fem grow, we'd love to have you at patreon.com/.fem. That's patreon.com/DOTFEMME.
Reacquiring signal.
Finally, in late 1985, Rock Hudson, who was a very famous actor of the 50s and 60s, he was a pretty good friend to Ronald and Nancy Reagan. He was this all-American heartthrob. Like, I'm trying to think of like a modern analog. Chris Evans. He would be like the Chris Evans of, you know, the 50s and 60s.
Sure.
It's long been kind of gossiped about that Rock Hudson might be gay, and he's been looking ill over the past year. But his public image consultant has always been saying, oh, he's dealing with cancer. It's not AIDS. It's not AIDS. He's not gay. Don't worry about it. But finally, in August of 1985, Rock Hudson announced that he's being treated for complications with AIDS. It's confirmed that he is gay. And unfortunately, a couple months after that, in October of 1985, he died from complications of AIDS. And that finally kind of shocked the public into taking this disease seriously. Okay, great. But it really sucks that it took 4 years and a famous movie star to die to get the attention of the public. But even then, there's this lack of education and awareness around it. And because people don't fully know about the disease, no one knows how it's transmitted. No one knows, you know, what the specific symptoms are. It's causing this fear mongering that is, you know, people they're avoiding being tested because they don't want to be positive, because then they might be ostracized or ridiculed. You know, people are forcing children out of school because these, you know, there are kids who are hemophiliacs who have contracted it through the tainted blood supply. Other students are worried that they might get it from being coughed on or something. So it's this absolute nightmare scenario, absolute chaos. And a lot of people in the presidential administration were urging the president to speak publicly and reassure the public that the medical community has found how the disease proliferates. It's through bodily fluid contact, mainly blood-to-blood contact, or through breastfeeding and sexual intercourse. That's pretty much how people get it. right? So as long as you're not having sex with an infected person, as long as you're not an infected mother nursing her baby, as long as you're not sharing needles with an infected person, it's fine. You can exist, routinely with someone who's infected and not have to worry about it. So, they're urging the president to go, comfort the public and reassure them, and he prepares to do this. But instead, at this press conference in September, right before Rock Hudson dies, Reagan kind of goes off script when someone asks about AIDS. And instead, he says that the medical community has not unequivocally said it is safe to attend school with AIDS sufferers. Wow. The reason he said that, this was something I didn't know until recently, right before this press conference. A White House lawyer who was named John Roberts, our current SCOTUS Chief Justice, John Roberts.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Pulled the president aside and handed him a memo that he had written that said specifically, I would not like to see the president reassuring the public on this point. We should assume AIDS can be transmitted through casual or routine contact until it is demonstrated that it cannot be. And that's what the president did. He didn't reassure the public at a time when he should have.
What do you think the gay community or just the general community would have done if he did reassure the public? How do you think things would have changed?
I don't know that it would have changed anything for the gay community, because it wasn't just AIDS that was doing that. AIDS provided a convenient scapegoat for people to, get on their moral high horse about how wrong being gay was and how, against nature and against God. And AIDS was just the proof of it.
Right.
So I'm not sure it would have necessarily changed anything for the gay community. What it would have done is it would have changed things for some kids.
Yeah.
There's a child in Indiana whose name was Ryan White, and he was a teenager. He had AIDS, and he and his family were activists, obviously. Mm-hmm. Ryan contracted AIDS through a tainted blood transfusion when he was I think 10 or 11, something like that, when he was, a few years younger. And he was forced out of his school by parents of fellow students who were scared. His house was shot at in a drive-by, again, because people were scared. There was a similar case that happened to a student in Florida their house was burned down in an act of arson in Florida. So I don't know if the president reassuring the public would have necessarily helped the gay community, but it definitely would have helped the hemophiliac community.
Well, also now that I have a better perspective, I could see how this statement that the president could have made could have helped the gay community in the sense of the ostracization of this disease.
There you go.
Yeah, because if he would have reassured people, then maybe the gay community wouldn't have been so stigmatized, because
maybe.
You wouldn't have to force people out of school, or you wouldn't have to fire people from work because they've contracted the disease and now you're afraid you're going to get it because someone coughs on you or something. It's these are the things that could have just it probably wouldn't have made a huge impact, but it definitely would have made an impact for a small group, I imagine. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it would have had some impact. It wouldn't have had a seismic shift, but I think you're right. I think it probably would have had some small impact.
Interesting.
I mean, it definitely would have made it, I think, maybe less distasteful for Senator Jesse Helms to do what he did a little bit later, but I'm jumping ahead of myself.
Wait, what did Jesse Helms do?
We'll get there, but first, we should mention that in May of 1987, this is 2 years into his second administration at this point, President Reagan finally addresses the topic of AIDS. This crisis has been going for 6 years now. 6 years.
Yep.
And half 500,000, if not more, Americans are infected with HIV at this point. And only now is he deciding to speak on it. He finally agrees to address the topic of AIDS in what is his first and I believe only speech on the subject that was held at an event for the American Foundation for AIDS Research. He agreed to go because a personal friend, actress Elizabeth Taylor, who was a very close friend of Rock Hudson and a friend of the Reagans, and she writes to the Reagans and asks them to come to this dinner, this like fundraiser dinner that the American Foundation for AIDS Research is having, which I think Elizabeth Taylor helped found that organization. And the Reagans agree to come, but Nancy Reagan was a little worried about how the president might approach the speech if his speechwriters wrote it. So instead, she had one of her speechwriters, a speechwriter named Landon Parvin, write the speech. And later, Mr. Parvin talks about how when he was writing this speech, how disinterested the president seemed about the topic, how he just didn't seem to really care throughout the writing process. White House advisors would continually contradict and second guess the medical research that Mr. Parvin was trying to incorporate into the speech. You know, so by the time that the speech was given, by the time Ronald Reagan actually gave the speech, it kind of didn't matter that Nancy Reagan tried to have one of her speechwriters write it, because the White House interfered so much that it wasn't great. And in fact, the president was publicly booed at the event.
Wow.
During this speech, President Reagan, he used AIDS as a reason to exclude certain classes of immigrants from immigrating,
wow,
you know, for curtailing certain civil rights, that kind of thing. And the crowd wasn't wild about it. And that was the only time President Reagan ever spoke about AIDS. So like, if you want to understand just the environment, the political and social environment that created this crisis, that kind of says it all. One speech 6 years later that isn't a very good one and then never talks about it again.
Wow.
You know, and it wasn't just limited to the president. I mean, there were other people in the government, like Senator Jesse Helms.
Oh, yeah.
He gave a speech on the Senate floor when he introduced a ban on federal dollars being used for AIDS education. He didn't want any taxpayer money being used to, quote, promote or encourage directly or indirectly homosexual activities. And all of this,
my God.
all of this because he saw a pamphlet that was created by the Gay Men's Health Club in New York City that was encouraging safe sex practices like using a condom to limit the spread of HIV. And he was so upset that he gave this long speech on the Senate floor about his disgust and revulsion, and it shouldn't in any way be condoned or encouraged.
He's homophobic.
And that measure passed. That ban on AIDS education funding passed 94-2 with the president's support. And at this time, more than 40,000 Americans had died from complications with AIDS, not to mention the 750,000 who were infected. I think for a lot of us that grew up in the 90s, I remember growing up hearing about AIDS and having to be careful around needles and blood spills and that kind of thing.
Yep, I remember that too.
I grew up in a time where it wasn't so much a crisis as it was at this time. And it's the scale of it is astounding. It's absolutely astounding. Right. Speaking of the 90s, the year 1990, the year I was born, represented this kind of watershed moment for the AIDS crisis because I showed up. I'm just kidding. That was the year that there's a really important AIDS researcher named Dr. Jonathan Mann. Mm-hmm. He had been researching the disease for years. He worked at the WHO on their AIDS research unit. But that year, he resigned from his post at the WHO pretty publicly due to, quote, personality differences with his boss, Director General Hiroshi Nakajima, because Nakajima had grown kind of jealous that Dr. Mann had become sort of the recognizable face of AIDS activism and WHO's AIDS research. At a time where like ego really shouldn't have been a thing, it crept in and made the situation untenable.
Jesus.
And so Dr. Mann left, and Dr. Mann's AIDS program was massive. It accounted for over a third of the WHO's budget.
Wow.
While the US wasn't necessarily dumping a bunch of resources into AIDS research, Europe and the rest of the world were. So Dr. Mann resigned. When he did, the AIDS research department at the WHO went from 250 scientists down to 4, just 4. So you can, like, he had a pretty big impact.
Yeah.
A lot of the scientists left in solidarity.
Wow.
And went to a new organization that Dr. Mann started. And over the next decade and a half, the epidemic evolved into a full-blown pandemic. By 1990, as many as 1 million Americans were infected, and it was only then that Congress passed a bill that funded comprehensive care for AIDS patients that couldn't afford insurance. It was called the Ryan White Care Act. It was named after that teenager.
Yep.
In 1991, it was starting to become really well known how much of a national security risk AIDS was posing. The CIA issued this classified memo that outlined how AIDS threatened the world's the world's security.
Oh, that's interesting.
And it was kind of uncanny at how accurate it predicted that like 45 million would be infected by the year 2000.
Wow.
Now, thankfully, at this time in 1991, Ronald Reagan's out of office.
Right.
President Bush is now in office, George H.W. Bush. And President Bush recognizes that more needs to be done about AIDS. He was a big part of why Congress passed that funding comprehensive care for AIDS patients. Congress also passed a new budget for CDC that included a lot more for AIDS research. And then in 1992, when President Clinton came into office, he had campaigned on, needing new leadership for AIDS response. He talked about how we needed a Manhattan Project type push around AIDS.
Yeah, that's a huge push.
And under President Clinton, funding for AIDS research tripled. Because of that increase in funding in 1996, the world changed forever.
Interesting.
What is now called the Triple Cocktail Regiment was announced at a global AIDS conference in Vancouver, British Columbia. It was part of an international effort to find. And what this meant was that from a scientific standpoint, from a medical standpoint, AIDS was no longer a death sentence.
Woo!
Before 1996, if you were diagnosed with AIDS, you were going to die 100%.
Yep.
It had I think something like a 95% mortality rate.
Wow.
And an average life expectancy of, I think, between 9 and 18 months when you were diagnosed with AIDS.
Wow.
After 1996, you could live a full lifespan, give or take, maybe 3 years. As Dr. Fauci puts it,
when I reflect on it, I go back and I refer to it as those dark years of working 15, 16, 17 hours a day with all of the people that you develop in a physician-patient relationship, and almost all of them died. But then to see going from those dire times to now, it's an outpatient disease. In fact, it doesn't even have to be a disease, because if a person is living with HIV before the virus starts to damage their immune system and ultimately their body in general, if you put them on an effective combination of drugs, you bring down the level of virus to below detectable, and literally that person can lead essentially a normal life expectancy. But the difference of a life expectancy of 12 to 15 months in a 21-year-old going up to a life expectancy in their 70s is breathtaking. You say it's a miracle, but if you don't believe in miracles, it's at least breathtaking.
That's magic. Yeah, that's
it's an
huge.
absolute miracle. 1996 was a massive year. Unfortunately, while AIDS no longer had to be a death sentence from a scientific and medical standpoint, from a practical standpoint, it still was, because the cost for this triple cocktail treatment was $16,000 per year in 1996. So
that's a lot.
That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money. And the people that are suffering most with AIDS are the ones who financially can't afford it. They're hemophiliacs that have already been saddled with any number of medical debt. They're queer people who are having trouble finding housing and work and economic stability. They are drug users who have been stigmatized and dealing with addiction. So $16,000, it's a scientific miracle, but it's still out of reach for a lot of people that are suffering from the disease.
Yeah.
Recognizing this problem, President Clinton authorizes some emergency funds to make the drugs available, but the wait list was pretty long and there were constant delays. You know, bureaucracy's a bitch. In these marginalized communities, the disease continues to spread almost unchecked. And a big part of that is due to denial, people refusing to get tested and find out whether or not they actually have the disease because they're scared of becoming pariahs and being, stigmatized. Stigma of being found out of being gay or even potentially associated with being gay.
I mean, especially then, many people there weren't as many protections either. So just the idea of you being gay could mean that you lose access to your livelihood, you lose your job, right? Family, friends, all sorts of stuff.
Right. But one of the reasons that, I wanted to do these episodes is because the aftermath of this crisis, we're still dealing with the aftermath.
Right. Yeah.
We've mentioned how you and I grew up in a post-1996 AIDS world where it wasn't a death sentence, but you and I are still feeling the effects, the wound that it has left on the gay community and the world.
Oh, massively.
But the gay community especially.
If you talk to any gay person over the age of, 40 or 50, it's so obvious the impact that it had on them and their lives.
I think that a lot of those who are younger in the community don't realize is that in the queer community, the two groups that were hardest hit by the AIDS epidemic were gay men and trans women. And this crisis wiped out an entire generation from the community in under 10 years. By 1996, I'm going to throw some numbers at you. By 1996, 10% of all self-identified gay men ages 25 to 44 had died. That's 1 in 15. 160,000 gay men had died from AIDS by 1996. We don't know the death toll for trans women because the WHO and the health department weren't collecting that particular data. The only reason they were collecting the data for self-identified gay men was because that seems to be where the epidemic started. But I did some math to estimate very conservatively what that number could look like. And what we do know is that a systematic review published in 2008 by Dr. Don Operario and colleagues revealed a prevalence of HIV in 27% of trans women who were engaged in sex work and 15% of trans women not engaged in sex work, according to limited data from 1980 to 2007. Again, this is very limited data. If we kind of average those two and estimate roughly around 20% of trans women had AIDS.
Were infected with AIDS.
Correct.
Yeah.
The estimated number of AIDS cases from 1980 to 1987 was 640,000 cases. A rough estimate suggests that half of all those cases were in the queer community, 320,000. Now, a conservative estimate says that about 10% of the queer community identify as trans women. So let's take that 320,000, 10%, that's 32,000 trans women with AIDS. Now, pre-HAART, pre-HAART, which is the triple cocktail drug regimen, the mortality rate of AIDS was between 60 and 70%, give or take. So if we conservatively estimate that, that's about 21,000 cases. That's a very conservative floor. Yeah. The number is probably way higher than that, but this may suggest that as many as 10% of all trans women died in the AIDS crisis, which is about the same, 10% of all gay men. And if you consider those victims, they would be about between the ages of 55 and 75 today. So I cannot help but think about how many elders and how much knowledge and wisdom was taken from us from the community by this disease and by the powers that be that let it flourish.
Yep.
Whenever you're in a queer community, a queer space, and you feel that silence around you, that sense that we're rebuilding from fragments, that's the sound of that missing generation, right? It's very hard for young queer folks to find those mentors because so many of them are gone. So many of them are gone, you know? These numbers that we talk about, how many had died, it's an undercount. We lost so many that we can't even speak to. It's, you know, it really was a crazy massacre. You know, this was sort of a silent massacre. I don't know what other words to use. There's a researcher for the American Foundation for AIDS Research, Mervyn Silverman, who once said that without question, politics was one of the driving forces in the spread of this disease. And I think that's true. I think,
Yeah, agreed.
you know,
Yeah.
you can see that in this episode. But, you know, the virus itself kind of has its own story to tell. And we touched a little bit on it here, but there's a lot more we can go into. And so next week, we're going to do exactly that. And we'll trace the medical reality of the AIDS crisis. We're going to talk about how the virus spread so rapidly, how it works, and how decades of research actually transformed it from a certain death sentence into a manageable condition, how we came up with that triple drug cocktail.
Science.
That's going to do it for us. If you like this episode, let us know. If you're listening on YouTube, you know, the whole spiel, leave a like, subscribe, drop a comment in the doobly-doo.
Doobly-doo.
If you're listening on Spotify, leave a comment there. You can do that now too. Let us know what you thought of the episode. We love to hear from you.
Love feedback.
You can find more episodes wherever you get your podcasts or directly on our website at .fempodcast.com. If you really enjoy queer history and want to help preserve these types of stories, you can support us financially by joining us on Patreon. It does take a lot of time and resources to do the research and record and bring these episodes. And I would love to be able to spend even more time researching and doing that. So if you want to support us financially, please do. You can do that over on Patreon at patreon.com/.fem.
And if you want to listen to the full unedited interview with Dr. Fauci, that's on Patreon too.
Yeah, that's true. I forgot to add that. Thank you. With that, thank you for listening. I'm Danielle Gonzalez.
I'm Claire.
We will see you next week, not in 2 weeks, but next week, to talk about the science and medicine of the AIDS crisis.